Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here again 5 years later. I enjoyed my visit so much last time, and I can't resist telling you that my most memorable moment here 5 years ago came at the book signing when a woman and her 9-year-old daughter came to have a book signed, and the little girl, probably both are here right now. I have enjoyed telling this story so much, so bear with me. The 9-year-old girl had a project in her school to become a Kentucky author for a day. So she chose me, and for a day in her school she had been Bobbie Ann Mason, and she had worn a costume befitting me, which I don't remember what she said the costume was, but she showed me her project, her page that started out, "Hello, my name is Bobbie Ann Mason. I was born in 1940, and yet I am still alive." And I enjoyed that so much, and 5 years later I am still alive. So I want to make sure I time this right. I want to read from The Girl in the Blue Beret, which is about Marshall Stone, and it's parallel narratives between his experience in the war, 1944, and 1980, when he starts thinking back to his time in the war. So the first chapter, I'll read the first chapter. It takes place in 1980. It's in Belgium, and they are speaking French, but you'll hear it in English. I think you'll gather what the situation is. Marshall was a B-17 co-pilot. As the long field came into view, Marshall Stone felt his breathing quicken, a rush of doves flying from his chest. The landscape was surprisingly familiar, its contours and borders fresh in his memory, even though he had been here only fleetingly 36 years ago. Lucien Lombard, who had brought him here today, knew the field intimately, for it had been in his family for generations. "It was over there, beside that tree, monsieur," Lucien said, pointing toward the center of the field, where an awkward sycamore hovered over a patch of unruly vegetation. "There was no tree then," Marshall said. "That is true." They walked through the furrowed field toward the tree, Lucien's sturdy brown boots mushing the mud, Marshall following in borrowed Wellingtons. He was silent, his memory of the crash landing superimposed on the scene in front of him, as if there were a small movie projector in his mind. The flying fortress, the B-17, the heavy bomber the crew called the Dirty Lily, had been returning from a mission to Frankfurt. "The airplane came down just there," said Lucien as they neared the tree. Lucien was elderly, probably in his 80s, Marshall thought, but he had a strong, erect physique, and he walked with a quick, determined step. His hair was thin, nearly white, his face smooth and firm. "This tree marks the site," he said. Unexpectedly, Marshall Stone began to cry. Embarrassed, he turned his face aside. He was a captain of transatlantic jumbo jets, a man who did not show weakness. He was alarmed by his emotion. Lucien Lombard nodded. "I know, monsieur," he said. In Marshall's mind, the crumpled B-17 lay before him in the center of the field. He recalled that the plane had been lined up with the neatly plowed furrows. The deep rumbling sound of a vast formation of B-17s roared through Marshall's memory now. the steady, violent, rocking flight toward target, the sight of Focke-Wulf 190s, angry hornets darting crazily, the black bursts of flak floating like tumbleweeds on a western highway, the fuselage, flak-peppered, slipping down into the cloud deck, flying for more than an hour, unprotected. And over Belgium, hit again, the nose cone shattering, the pilot panicking. Marshall, the co-pilot, took the controls and brought the Dirty Lily down, a belly landing on this foreign soil. There was no time to jettison the ball turret. Only as they were coming down did Marshall see that Lawrence Webb, the pilot, was unconscious. The fort grazed the top of a tall hedgerow and slid in with a jolt, grinding to a hard stop. The crew scrambled out. Marshall and the flight engineer wrestled Webb's slack body from the plane. The navigator's face was torn, bloodied. The fuselage was burning. Machine gun rounds were exploding at the gun stations. Marshall didn't see the tail gunner anywhere. The left waist gunner lay on the ground, motionless. Marshall had been just 23 years old then. Now he was nearly 60, and he had come to see this place again at last. He was crying for the kids in the B-17, the youngsters who had staked their lives on their flying fortress. He hadn't known he had pent up such a reservoir of emotion, even though he probably thought about the downing of the B-17 every day. He willed his tears to stop. Lucien Lombard had seen the plane come down that day, and he rushed to help the crew, but Marshall didn't remember him. Now, Lucien said, it is like yesterday. Marshall towed a weed-topped clod of dirt. The worst day of my life, he said. Some bad memories. Never mind, monsieur, it had its part. Several people were crossing the field, headed toward them. Everyone from the village has heard of your visit, said Lucien. You are a hero. No, I did very little. Marshall was ashamed. Lucien introduced him to the group. They were all smiling at him and speaking rapidly. When Marshall could not follow some of their thickly accented French, Lucien explained that everyone there remembered the crash. 3 families had sheltered members of the crew, and Dr. Becquet had treated the wounded. More introductions and small talk followed. Marshall noticed 2 men scanning the ground. Lucien explained that people still found pieces of metal there, even a warped propeller blade. Marshall thought of how he had torn up the field when he came zigzagging down that day. A man in a cloth cap and wool scarf stepped forward and touched Marshall's arm. Oui, it is sad, monsieur, the man said. He regarded Marshall in a kindly way and smiled. He seemed familiar. You were the boy who helped me, Marshall said, astonished. Oui, c'est moi. You offered me a cigarette. The man laughed. Bien sûr, I would never forget that day, the cigarettes I had obtained for my father. That was my very first Gauloise, Marshall said. You were my very first Americain, the man said, smiling. I am Henri Le Chat. You warned me that the Germans were coming, Marshall said. Henri nodded. It is true. You had no French then, and I had no English. But I knew, Marshall said. We communicated somehow. Marshall's voice broke on the word communicated. We will never forget, monsieur. You told me to run, Marshall said, recalling how he had stowed the cigarette in the inner pocket of his leather jacket. Now he felt his tears well up again. Henri tugged on his scarf. I told you to hide in the woods, he said, and you comprehended. Recalling the boy's urgency, Marshall tried to laugh. Henri had raced up, calling a warning. Pointing back the way he had come, he cried, Les Allemands, les Allemands. Then pointing to the woods in the other direction, he shouted, Allez-y. Marshall did not see any Germans, and he would not leave until all the crew was out. The bombardier was wounded in the shoulder, and the navigator had a shattered leg. The tail gunner appeared. He had hopped out easily. The left waist gunner was unconscious and had to be pulled from the fuselage window. Marshall was relieved to see the ball turret gunner, who was limping toward the church with a man carrying a shovel. Someone said the right waist gunner had parachuted. The pilot was lying on the frozen ground, his eyes closed. Fire was leaping from the plane. Marshall knelt by Webb, trying to wake him. Nothing. Someone squatted beside Marshall and opened Webb's jacket. Doctor, the woman said, pointing toward the village. She pointed in the opposite direction toward the woods and said, Go. Marshall stood. The flight engineer appeared at his side. Let's go, he said. Everybody's out. Several of the villagers were making urgent gestures toward the road. German troops would be here in moments. Marshall knew that they converged on every fallen plane to arrest the Allied aviators and to salvage the wrecked metal for their own planes. The German fighter that had downed them was circling low overhead. Marshall began running toward the woods. Had the Germans shot anyone from the village for helping the American flyers? Marshall wondered now, but did not want to ask. He had tried to be sure all the crew were out, and then he left the scene. In the years after, he didn't probe into the aftermath. He lived another life. We were so thankful to you, monsieur, one of the men was saying. When your planes flew over, we knew we would be liberated one day. Marshall nodded. A stocky woman with gray thick hair and a genial wrinkled face said, The airplanes flying toward Germany in those days, there were hundreds of them. We rejoiced to see them cross the sky. Henri kicked dirt from his leather boot. He said, I didn't know at that age everything that was understood by the adults, but I knew the deprivation, the difficulties, the secrecy. Even the children knew the crisis. Cautiously, Marshall asked, Did the Germans arrest anybody for helping us? Oh, no, monsieur. Henri paused. Not that day. Lucien Lombard clasped Henri's shoulder and said, The father of this one was killed, shot on his bicycle, on his way home after convoying one of your aviateurs across the border to France. Henri said, I had to grow up quickly. I had the responsibilities then for my mother and my sisters. Lucien said, his family hid that aviateur in their barn for a time. Marshall recoiled. He could see the waist gunner lying motionless across the furrows. He saw himself running into the woods. He saw the boy's face. The plane was on fire. Marshall had decided to return to this place finally, knowing it was time to confront his past failure. He had expected to be alone in the field, and he had not thought anyone would remember. The news of the death of the boy's father jolted him. He had never heard about that. In all these years, he had thought little about the people who had come running to the downed airplane. He had felt such a profound defeat in the war that he had not wanted to return here. During the war, more than anything, he had wanted to be heroic. But he was no hero. He had felt nothing but bitter disappointment that he didn't get to complete his bombing missions against Nazi Germany. And what happened later, as he skulked through France, was best forgotten, he had thought. Marshall was a widower. His wife, Loretta, had died suddenly 2 years before, and the loss still seemed unbelievable, but now he began to feel his grief lift, like the morning fog disappearing above a waiting airport. Marshall, as an airline captain, 747s, and he's spending his layover in Paris when he had decided to go up to Belgium to see the old crash site. Here he is in Paris at the, I think, the Place de la Jardin de Tuileries. To Marshall's right, somewhere along the Rue de Rivoli, was a metro stop. He and a brash bombardier named Delancey had stumbled up from the metro, scared, towering like Lombardy poplars among the crowd of much shorter Frenchmen. If they missed their contact, they would be stranded, lost amidst the Germans circulating around them in their menacing gray-green uniforms. She was there. He saw her first, sitting on a bench reading a timetable. There was a quietness to the crowd, as if people were on their best behavior. Marshall had doubted that a mere schoolgirl would be sent as their contact, but there she was, sitting with a book satchel and earnestly consulting a timetable. The agent's directions had been precise. Find the girl in the blue beret. She will have a timetable and a leather school bag. Marshall remembered that moment vividly. She had been waiting there, her blue beret standing out like a flower against the barren winter gardens of the Tuileries. As he neared now the Place de la Concorde, he thought of the Concorde, the SST. He wished it would fly over, a happy coincidence, tying history in a knot. Moments of history entwined here. Marie Antoinette lost her head. The Egyptian obelisk replaced the guillotine. Napoleon dreamed the triumphant arch. Marshall felt his own history emanate from him, as if he had been holding it condensed in a small spot inside himself. Reviewing his past was new for Marshall, something that had started as he approached his 60th birthday and retirement. Tomorrow was his final flight. In 1980, an airline captain was forced to retire at age 60. And Marshall, being a flyer, loves nothing but flying. And what he's going to do in his future is just a blank. But this memory of 1944 is awakened now. The people who had helped him in Paris during the war would be retired now, he thought. The French retired young. Robert. Marshall didn't recall the young man's last name, but he would never forget him. Robert and his clandestine missions. He remembered Robert appearing in the small hours of the morning with an urgent message. He remembered Robert letting his rucksack fall to the floor, then reaching in like a magician to produce cigarettes or a few priceless eggs. Once he pulled out an actual rabbit, skinned and purple. From inside the lining of his coat came thin papers with secret messages. Whatever happened to him after the war? Marshall has the future cut out for him now. He wants to go back to France and look up the people who had helped him during the war. I don't know how much time I have, but I want to read you some of his memories of Annette, the girl in the blue beret. Back in his Paris hotel, 1980, alternating between insomnia and waking dreams, he could hear Annette Vallon's sing-song French, her playful teasing. During those 3 weeks in 1944, he thought he saw the soft baby fat of her cheeks grow thinner. Her mother insisted on giving him the largest portions of food. "You are large, monsieur," Madame Vallon told him. "We do not need so much." "I don't want this," Annette said, moving a carrot on her plate. "You may have it." Perhaps she still needed the nourishment of milk, he thought. The milk ration for children only was for her younger sister, Monique. He remembered the way Annette and her mother hugged so casually. He could see in them a happiness that persisted despite the hardships of wartime. Madame Valland had embraced him too. He watched her practice her art. With a small piece of chicken, a dab of saved butter, and some elaborate fussing with the pots on the wood stove, she made a terrine, a sort of chicken jello with a yellow layer at the bottom. She flavored it with bits of dried herbs. "You need your strength for your journey," she said, giving him a second helping. He didn't know when the journey would be or how. One evening, she cooked a pot of tripe, the only item the butcher had left, she said. Marshall was revolted when he saw her scrubbing and soaking the hog's entrails that afternoon. He ate sparingly, but Monsieur Valland treated the dish as a delicacy, making soft groans of appreciation. With more butter and some cream, this could be almost divided, all of them. She rubbed a piece of leftover bread with some mint and a little oil. He had built a small fire in the stove with some chips of coal and paper, so her mother could make coffee, a substitute made of acorns or perhaps cocoa burrs and birdseed. Marshall didn't know. "Perhaps Maman will bring an egg," Annette said. "Mais no, you and your mother should have the egg, not moi. No, you have half, and Maman and I share half." She wiped the pan with the lump of bread she had saved. She smiled. "Perhaps Maman will bring some butter and cinnamon and cornmeal," he said. She didn't understand, and when he explained, she turned up her nose. "One doesn't eat that," she said. "Food for the animals." Marshall said, "Then maybe she will bring some more of those delicious pig guts we had last night." "Oh, les tripes, bon, bon, They laughed. He asked her, "Do your parents hide many aviators? How do you feed them?" He wasn't supposed to ask his helpers questions, so the Krauts couldn't force anything out of him if he got caught. And she shrugged. "We manage." "And what do you do?" He knew she went somewhere Friday afternoons after school. "You are not to know." She smiled. "The Germans, if they are on the bus, I put my books beside me and occupy as much space as possible. I enjoy making inconvenience for them. Also, it is amusing to drop my books at their feet. In a way, they are gentlemen. 'Oh, mademoiselle, I must assist you.' And in another way, they are ready to make the arrest. But they do not the schoolgirls. So they think they are kind and helpful, but we are laughing at them. Every little bit of trouble we can cause, innocently. Oh, it is only the schoolgirls. As a way to express our frustration." "Should you be provoking the Germans?" he asked. "It sounds dangerous." "I know," she said, "but how can one resist?" Maybe one more passage? In the morning, Marshall chatted with Annette as she and Monique prepared for school. He said, "Your parents are magnificent. You too. You're all very brave." "No," she said, "we have to be careful, but we must help you. You are our cause. If we don't help the aviator and get them back safely, then we have done nothing." He remembered he was sitting on a divan. She leaned over and gave him a quick two-cheek kiss. Then she lifted her satchel and headed for school. "You are very nice," she said, turning at the door. Thank you.